I suppose you all heard of Dr. Sojo Bones, a very bitter enemy to Deacon Jones.
Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we make an appointment at Chapter 37, The Doctor's Office, Oakland, California, 1912. Little 4-year-old Willie is walking home from Sunday school in formation with the other Fred Finch orphans in Oakland. He breaks off and finds his way to Diamond Canyon, where he watches insects skimming the surface of water with flawless ease and skill. He leaves the park and finds his cohorts had already moved on, so he recalls his way back to the orphanage and sets off alone. He makes his way home only to get hit by another boy on a bicycle, knocked down, injuring his head. His siblings run to his aid, get a referral for a doctor's appointment from their superintendent, and he and Sister Cosette take the streetcar down into Oakland for treatment. Willie gets stitched up. He and Cosette take the streetcar home, and the superintendent congratulates Willie on being a good boy. But to young Willie, the worst hurt was the embarrassment of the accident in the first place. He says that he was disgraced in that he was removed from the dimension of grace, unlike those insects he had watched. This was the height of embarrassment for him. Oakland in 1912 had a population of about 150,000. By comparison, today it has over 400,000. It wasn't tiny, but the children were becoming used to the independence associated with not having their parents and a true home of their own. The Fred Finch Orphanage was up in the hills, some distance from downtown. John Wesley Hagan, the superintendent, was a decent man trying to do right by all the foundlings in his care, many of whom did have parents who couldn't afford to take care of them, and many of whom had no parents. In his own words,
the Fred Finch Orphanage. Captain Finch, a well-to-do man of boats, ships, lost a son named Fred, and he put up this orphanage as a memorial to that boy. The boy died of some disease, I don't know. The next 5 years, I had always imagined, inaccurately, so many things are inaccurate, that it had been 4 years, but actually it had been 5 years. The next 5 years were spent at the Fred Finch Orphanage, which everybody who lived there and was subject to the rules and regulations of that place either hated or pretended to hate. I hated the place, but I must also confess that having my brother there in the boys' wards and having the two sisters over there in the girls' wards, that I was hardly what could be called anything like the abandoned, lonely orphans of most kids in such places, or of legend and lore as in Oliver Twist, which I read at the age of 9 or 10, and put me to worrying about that little boy over there in that place that gave him such meager food, gruel and stuff.
John Wesley Hagan and his wife, Lillian Pender, ran the orphanage in 1912. Saroyan wrote in Sons Come and Go, Mothers Hangin' Forever, "If I were to start at the top, as the saying is, remembering the people of the world I have met, one of the very first would have to be John Wesley Hagan, the superintendent of the Fred Finch Orphanage in Oakland. He was surely not more than 6 feet tall, not heavy at all, and not more than 40 years of age." He also described the other staff, John Forderer on the board of directors, who would take boys on rides in his automobile, and died in a car crash along with one of the boys from the orphanage. He recalled the Irish cook who was hearty and loving with her meat pies. Blanche Fulton was a volunteer social worker that took the boys on excursions, including to the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915. Miss Winchester was the matron of the boys' ward and regularly bathed them. He writes, "It was only after having finally left the place that I, for one, began to see the orphanage as not having been anywhere near as rotten as it might have been, and it was quite simply true that the Irish cook's meat pie was one of the finest table experiences in my life. But they were fine women just the same. They tried their best to be mothers to the sons of unknown mothers, mad mothers, criminal mothers, and all kinds of other mothers. But the sons wouldn't have them, couldn't have them, had to have the original or no mother at all." In The Bicycle Rider in Beverly Hills, he tells the same tale in a slightly different way. "Peralta Street was in the hills, which were not big. I was walking down that road one day when a boy on a bicycle knocked me down. My head struck one of the jagged stones bordering the road, and I got up with a cut over my left eye. I wasn't hurt, but I was surprised and annoyed, and I began to bawl, although I knew I didn't need to. No one believed I didn't need to, though. My face was covered with blood. I might have gone on bawling, but I couldn't imagine what the good of that would be. So I stopped. I was bored. John Wesley Hagan took me by horse and wagon to a doctor who sewed the cut together. It was no trouble for the doctor to do this simple surgical work. The man sewed the flesh back together, and I stood and waited while he did it. He said nothing. John Wesley Hagan said nothing, and I said nothing. After that, John Wesley Hagan and I were friends, and the theory that I was a brave fellow got around in an orphanage. It was a false theory as far as I was concerned, because I hadn't saved anybody from drowning in the sea or from burning to death in a small locked room somewhere. I didn't go to any trouble to dispute the theory, though, mainly, I think, because I didn't know how." He ends this chapter, "The thing that hurt was the accident itself, the foolishness of it. I've always hated having foolish things happen to me." This is the crux of the chapter. Being thrust into the orphanage, his world was completely upended. Any sense of order was lost, and the need to gain control over his life was magnified, even as a small child. Without the comforting protection of his parents, young Willie felt adrift, and he felt a responsibility for himself that most small children don't feel. This need for control would never be lost. As a child and young man, he took jobs that allowed him freedom and independence, like selling newspapers whenever and wherever he could, or delivering telegrams in the way he chose, which was usually swiftly and by bicycle. When he began publishing, he maintained a certain amount of control over his work, never releasing his copyright to magazines. When he began writing plays and scripts, he wanted to direct them. Such was his mind that he saw his words in one way that shouldn't be altered. In this way, he could never be mistaken, and any errors would be his own responsibility. And as we learned in Chapter 35, he didn't like taking charity from friends, but insisted on working his way out of a bind, even if that work included the luck of the cards or other gambling. Saroyan didn't like surprises and looking foolish by accident. In an interview from 1975, he explained, "I share with every human being in the world an understandable wish not to be a fool. I also share with almost everybody in the world, perhaps there are some exceptions, having been a fool and being a fool. To pretend otherwise would be dishonest, and I cannot pretend it. I would rather not be a fool, I believe. But I do share the folly of all of us. It has mortified my soul. I have, under really inexcusable circumstances, made an awful fool of myself. There's no lullaby in what I'm trying to say, and not having the right to do so." He also wrote in Not Dying, "A writer is likely to make a fool of himself by trying for more, but I think it's worth it, and I haven't been afraid of making a fool of myself. You can't avoid making a fool of yourself to some extent in any case. No matter what you write or how you write it, if you're afraid of that, you'd better think twice about wanting to be a writer. You can't be bothered about picayune things like seeming to be a fool to other people or like actually being one. If you want to be a maker of things who doesn't want to become only so skilled that everything he makes is absolutely safe, no harm, no trouble at all, very skilled, very polished, and not much better than another glazed plate to put with 100 earlier ones of the same kind." In other words, he wanted to control his own narrative, including making foolish choices, so long as they were his choices to make. This isn't revelatory, as most people crave control over their life and surroundings. However, it's telling that he writes the story of tumbling at the orphanage to demonstrate just how deeply felt that trait was in him. It's not that he didn't take chances, but that he didn't want chance to overtake him. For many years, he didn't write about the orphanage. In The Bicycle Rider in Beverly Hills from 1952, he began revealing the impact of this period of his life, and readers and critics began to have an understanding of the challenges he had endured early on that formed the man. His stories weren't always consistent, but the basic shape of his memories held, in order to paint a picture of how a person develops and becomes their final form. All of the episodes about the orphanage in all of his books are fertile ground for analyzing his later actions, and he was aware of this and allowed this. Even his inclusion that crying bored him spoke to a restlessness he always had, and that he may not have known how to naturally express his emotions, but emulated other children. Mastery of his emotions and control of his narrative were key parts of his personality, at least in part cultivated by the early years at the orphanage, feeling like he had no home and no safe haven. The Fresno years helped him gain back some of that security, but the 5 years in Oakland had already formed a permanent impression. Especially in his early stories, he has a strong control of the language and rhythm, and no word is wasted. In his novels, and especially when his memoirs came out, critics did accuse him of being more aimless and loose with his words, but what shot him to fame was the careful control of language that he maintained exquisitely until about 1942. The doctor's office is an interesting setting for this chapter. Though most of it revolves around the embarrassment of the fall, he was taken in and helped by a competent stranger, and then he was considered brave for his stoicism. There are 2 roads that could be taken. One leads to the benefits and spoils of accepting someone's help, and the other of going it alone to show a different braveness, one that ultimately isn't as satisfying and truly doesn't jibe with his insistence on the brotherhood of mankind. There's also the connection between madness, which he writes of often as part of his DNA, and the help from a doctor, even if in this chapter it's merely helping to cure a hurt ego. By 1970, just before he published this book, he was accepting the lack of control over his life, having experienced so many painful reminders. One really doesn't want to be a fool, it just happens. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.